So that was essentially a little bit of an ad for the Screen Composers Guild. The original music was made by Ray Harmon, another guild member. So, Brian, you're all very welcome here today, panel. I'm going to start with you, Brian. If you could tell us a little bit about what a screen composer is, or I often ask when I'm asked to interview composers, I ask them, when did you start calling yourself a screen composer? So if you tell us a little bit about the trajectory of the career or the...
Okay, well, what is a screen composer? I guess a screen composer is the person responsible for creating original music, the function of which is to, elevate the mood or emotion of any particular range of visual media. So it can be, as you said, it could be feature film, it could be documentary, video game, TV drama, animation, and even commercials.
And
I was trying to figure out how to answer this in an all-encapsulating way. It's kind of hard to do it. But I would say at a very top tier, the way in which we work, we have a relationship with either the director or the creative lead on a project. And fundamentally, it's our job to help them realize their vision. And then how that breaks down to a workflow, it's impossible to categorize that. It's vastly different depending on lots of things, primarily the format. So the workflow for a feature film will be much different to even a TV drama, or at the other end of the scale, a commercial, for example, which could be started and finished within a day. And then there's other factors like budget, the genre of music, is it an orchestrated piece of music, and what that entails, and the people you need involved for that. And then just down to the person themselves, I think. And it is fundamentally an artistic expression, and we all have our kind of own way of doing that, and have found that through kind of random methods mostly as to what works for us. And so that, it's different for everyone.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great description. So an artist, but a collaborator, and somebody who can work. Because it's a craft as well, I would say, as well as being a creative art. There's a lot of craft involved in being able to fit into a multi-element production. Natasha, can you tell me a little bit then about the music department itself? So, and it was interesting looking at the previous talk at some of the slides. So some of the very high value productions that would have come and shot here, such as Foundation and Moonhaven. If you look them up on IMDb and go to music department, you'll see quite a significant list of people. So, who are they, and how does that compare then to, say, music department in an Irish feature or lower budget production?
I suppose because I work quite a bit on orchestral scores, so we need quite a few people to actually make it happen. So obviously, I would write the music, and I would create the score. But then I would work very much. Well, first of all, I should say that we work very much closely with the editor, the film editor, and the director. You get a mock-up. I do a mock-up of the actual score, which is with samples, which actually sounds pretty good. But these days they're pretty good, but it doesn't have that lift of live musicians.
So this is using kind of MIDI sampled instruments and a computer, and a keyboard in front of a computer. It's fascinating to watch composers work
in the dark. And for a good director to see or hear what it sounds like, it's a really good tool, because then they have a sense of what the music's going to be like. But you always preface it by saying, look, this is what it's going to be like. It's going to be better and more alive. So therefore, for example, I would work with an orchestra. So then I would, once you get the sign off for the mock-up, I would create the score, which is quite, that takes time. And I always say to filmmakers, especially with live instrumentation and if it's an orchestra, to leave composers enough time in the post-production to put it all together, because it just takes so long to take it out of the MIDI, out of the computer onto an actual score. That takes, I think for 40 minutes took me a good solid week, maybe even 10 days. And then you would work with a team. I would work with a copyist who then, so obviously I have your score, but then each musician needs their part and that can be quite a big job in regards if you have 45 players to create all these parts. So we'd work with a copyist who would do that, and then you have another group that actually does all the printing and the taping, and then also you have a music technologist who creates the PT set, the Pro Tool session. You have a sound engineer in the booth as well, and then you have a conductor. So just from that end of the post-production, it's like 5-6 people involved in that.
To create that 40 minutes of music.
Yeah, but it's so worth it because it just.
And then you do the orchestration and arranging yourself, because some composers
that's
not do that.
Yes, there's some people who would work as I orchestrate my own music, but especially in the Hollywood films, and I did work in LA with composers who had a team of orchestrators. You'd have about 5 orchestrators.
Wow,
it's huge because they're turning it around really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So the composer will write all of the themes and sketches of the music, then they give it to all the orchestrators, and I was working with part of that team who then flesh it out into a full orchestra, and then it goes down the line of the copyist and the music technologist.
Cool. So anyone who's into budgets should be going cha-ching, 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 because that is all. I don't know what roughly per minute in a studio with an orchestra. I know Ian talked about this recently, like if there's a mistake even, or, it's a hugely expensive. So on a low budget or a lower budget Irish, say, feature where you're getting maybe, and the fees can range radically, but say maybe 20 to 30,000 would not be unnormal, say, if you were to do a documentary. So what can you achieve out of that, which also includes the composer fee? So just to explain, I suppose the composer is given the budget as the HOD, of which they pay themselves, and then budget the production and delivery and re-edit and re-delivery and re-edit and re-delivery, and contracting and legal fees, and maybe an agent commission as well. So what could you do with the smaller?
So obviously, yes, lots of, we all struggle with the smaller budget. And then that's where I suppose samples comes in again. Like you can use, as a composer, use samples. But I always like to, again, add a live element. So I would bring people into my home. I have a recording space at home, and I know Brian's got an amazing studio. And just to bring in 5 musicians, and then you mix that in, or so that's for a bigger sound. But also, a lot of films, and this is where we'll talk about later, is the intimate sound. You don't need a full orchestra, a big sound. So you just get your 3-4 people and play whatever you can play yourself as a composer, and you can create an amazing score for a lower budget. So that's how you could.
So that might be the more typical.
I would be.
Stephen, so we were just talking outside about how it's changed quite radically over the last 20 years, where maybe it would have been unusual to have a composer working on feature films, even being able to remain based in Ireland. It would have been a kind of an expected journey to go off to LA or London or some other. So, I mean, there's more composers able to base themselves in Ireland. What type of work can they hope to access from here? And you have, as well as the titles I've mentioned, you've worked on a lot of co-productions that maybe people will be less aware of.
Yeah, it's my head at the moment is like all these sheep trying to get through a gate at the same time, because everything that Brian and Natasha are saying, I'm kind of, and there's this and there's this, and you can't. So I'm going to just kind of splurge.
Let the sheep through.
First of all, I think we're now at a time in the Irish creative industry, and the word industry I have to put a little code beside, because it's kind of, I started off in this for the art side of it in my idealistic 20s, but film is this very it's a very thing I often say, film is a combination of art and commerce in very different ratios, and we've probably all had experience where it's a lot of commerce and very little art, and then sometimes, like on Colleen Q, you get the chance to work on something which is 99% art, and the most uncynical thing I've ever worked on, and it's such a joy to get those. But Sunniva will know that when we started, like literally actually in this building, myself, Lenny, and Ed Guiney 30 years ago, making
thing about Lenny's grandfather when it was still the Quaker Meeting House. Just, there was no film business. There was no. We were also living in a society where women had been completely marginalised, where we, as a young republic, had culled half of our intellectual and whatever by making women leave jobs to go and like. We're still in recovery from that, and as an industry, we're still in recovery. So for me, it's not. It's a very important thing where we've come from, because it's only through people like yourself and Brian and the organisation that composers are meeting other composers, because everyone used to be very isolated, and you'd hear about, I go, Brian Crosby, what's he doing? How come he's getting it? Or whatever it would be. And that was the way it was. It was the same when people were directing. Like, I remember 20 years ago when there was a pot of money for directors, the Arts Council would be given out. The only thing you got from the Arts Council was an Arts Council flight to London. And it was like, and it was really, really hard. There was so little money around. So the relevance of that, the legacy of that is that I think almost everything we do in Ireland is underfunded. And so there's a model of underfunding that's still based in the past. Because when I've worked for, say, UK production companies, they have a completely different attitude. They're not trying to, up till now, they haven't been trying to take your intellectual property as much. If you work for the BBC, it's fantastic. They give you so much ownership still. There's a kind of model that they have that we've benefited from. And again, another thing I say is that in Ireland, if you've got 10 million, you try and make a 15 million film. You don't make a 10 million film for 10 million. And the knock-on for that is that you go to all the heads of department and go, well, we don't have as much as we hoped, so we know you should be getting this, but we can only give you this. Now, when you heard what Natasha said in terms of if you want a first class, what they call, like on my contracts, I'm supposedly supposed to give a first class score. It actually says that, to deliver a first class score. How that works, I have no idea. I certainly have failed on numerous occasions. But you cannot do that for that money, because effectively what people are saying is, if we give you 30 grand, 28 grand of that is going to end up going on your costs, and you get 2 grand for working for 6 months, and you kind of go, that model is not sustainable.
Yeah.
What happens then is you get people who are very enthusiastic, who really want to do it in their 20s and their 30s and maybe their 40s, but you get to my age and you go, it's not sustainable. And I'm really lucky. I'm doing well compared to lots of people who are doing brilliant work, being involved in important projects, but are getting squeezed.
Yeah.
So we have to change the model of how this stuff works if you want to have really good people. Because the way it is at the moment, it will push people out of it and they'll end up doing other stuff. And there are productions now which are well funded, where the producers do make, there are times when producers do a project and they don't make money because they're being squeezed as well. Everybody's being squeezed now because we live in a society where people are just, it's all about the profit. It's all about, shareholders getting the money back, whatever. It's a broader societal issue, but we are involved in it. And we, as people who want to be, at least have, I suppose, some artistic aspiration, want to have. Am I saying anything relevant to what you're asking?
Saying relevant stuff.
And I want to start a new party. But it is, look, it's all part of, there is a kind of thing, like I say, I'm really lucky. And I'm lucky the people I've got to work with. I'm lucky where I started. I'm lucky that Lenny continues to use me, and long may it last. And I will never speak to him again if he uses somebody else. And I'm given opportunities to work on things now that, and I'm luckily I'm able to say no to stuff that I don't like or whatever. But I don't know if that's going to be the same in 2 years. I don't know what's like. There's no career path. There's no. It's not like you can enter a club where they decide to give you, now that because you are who you are, you get a 50 grand annual stipend or something. We're part of the gig economy.
Yeah.
And as such, it means actually when we do a job, it might be one of 2 or 3 jobs we do that year. We have to make money to pay bills. We have to do that. It's unsustainable, actually, I think, for people to keep.
I think, yeah. And one of the things I wanted to show in that promo film that we did is the level of investment that composers put into the creative screen industry. You're being available for scoring short films, pilots, and the lower budget feature Irish docs, and there's a huge amount of risk in it. Now, the risk that Stephen put into on Colleen Kuhn will hugely pay off. But we are moving into an area where, and I'm kind of skipping ahead here, where that may no longer be possible because there is a kind of an attack on the rights that composers have. So you mentioned intellectual property there. This has been a key funder for a lot of composers over the lifetime of their career, and what we're seeing now with international streamers. Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about that, what we're seeing kind of coming from Europe? And
I just read this morning, I was on the Canadian Guild's, Composer Guild's website, and they have a big piece about what they have seen over the last 2 years, and they have, I think, quoted the statistic that their members have seen up to a 95% decrease, so that's up to a 95% decrease in the royalty they receive, specifically due to how we now consume, so as in we look at Netflix instead of watching TV. And so, yeah, these, you know, I think there are two factors. A, the way in which royalties are distributed for, we'll call them VODs, so video on demand services. There's less trickling back to the composer. But there's also like a bunch of like coercive practices happening, primarily where composers are essentially coerced to giving away all of their rights. And so by that I mean they transfer all of the rights to the producers of the show, which will result in no royalty coming back to them. And now you could say that, you know, we shouldn't accept that. Let's just say, no, that's not for me. But the reality of the situation is if you do say that, they would just simply go to the next person in line. So it's not really a choice that we have. So that's really worrying. There's also one kind of other worrying trait that's happening. That's the use of royalty-free music from music libraries, and that's hugely affecting what's left in the pie for original music, because it's becoming increasingly attractive for productions to use this kind of off-the-shelf music. But when you look behind the scenes of how that off-the-shelf music has been made, you generally see that the composer, again, has been offered a pretty shitty fee, again, to assign all of the rights into that music library. And they don't, you know, if it is placed in a production, the composer doesn't see any return for that. So they're completely being cut out of the commercial cycle that has, we actually can't survive in it. It's probably, for most of us, the biggest part of our income stream.
Non-sustainable. And I definitely think I think there might be some idea that, well, that's kind of what's happening because of streamers. But I think if you look at the makeup of a lot of the international streamers, they say up to 70% of their assets are non-tangible. Some of that is goodwill, but a lot of that is also rights. So they are very aware of the value of rights. This is, I would argue personally, most definitely a kind of quite a concerted money grab, essentially, from creators. So we do need, I mean, another area I like to talk about people working in advertising. I think there's can be sometimes a slight shame in it, but advertising has always really funded Irish composers' careers as well, and something that isn't included, say, in the artist exemption in tax, and also now is under attack because of this digital disruption and the move. But we won't get too depressed about this.
So I was just going to say, though, it is why that's really relevant is that it just means that eventually the quality will just go down. It just keeps going down because people will have to get out of the business. It's not a business because people are normally doing it because they love music or they've got a background in music, and they've got, I mean, my background is slightly different in that I was a filmmaker and I ended up doing music, and I kind of ended up here by accident in a way. But if you do that, it's a race to the bottom. And it is that we are, you know, it's in the film business. If you win the lottery, you can make a film, and you can make a film about anything you want. You don't need a qualification. It doesn't have to be best practice. There doesn't have to be anything. There is a Wild West you know, a legacy of the Wild West from Hollywood and from just, you know, it's an adventure to make a feature film. So if you can convince somebody to write a score for €500, nobody's going to give out to you. It's like well done, because it means there's more for you. The problem is that you know, it is eventually you just end up with really bad production values, and that's why it's relevant. It isn't that we're saying, oh, we need to make more money, but there's just a basic line, and there is a thing where you kind of go, the fee is small at the front, and now we're taking what used to be a revenue stream for you because the fee at the front was small, and it's kind of there's something incredibly cynical about it. You know, it's kind of hard to explain what the royalty thing was for so many people. It used to get it like quarterly, and you'd get that check in the post, and it would be this magic check that would kind of keep you going. And the idea that that's now being eaten into because somebody somewhere who had a lot of money in a fund is now able to kind of finance the repainting of their swimming pool ahead of you. But I mean, that is really, you know, it's like even if you get a percentage of the production, you get a percentage of producers' profits. Producers' profits is this weird nebulous thing whereby, you know, the producer can pay for his car parking and all before you would ever get any of the money. And if something, you know, it's a thing where it would even make sense if it, you know, on the production that if they can't pay up front, well, then you get points. Because in the vast majority of cases, you're not going to make anything from those points because most productions don't make money.
And retain all your rights.
Yeah, I mean, you know, anyway, so I just wanted to.
No,
There's
and
another
I think
sheet
it's,
getting
I
through the
think it's
gate.
really important, and I think, you know, recently I was talking to somebody in the Arts Council as well, and I know we have Arts Council people in the audience, and somebody said something to me about, you know, we really fund uncommercial music or non-commercial music, and I thought, well, there is no such thing as non-commercial music. Like all music attracts, and all music which attracts an audience attracts revenue. It can be about who ultimately gets that revenue or what happens to that revenue. And if it's a case of, you know, a huge opera with a lot of people involved, it's going to take a lot of revenue to pay that. And that's where it's so important to be supportive. But similarly, if you're a composer working in this area, you need to have the studios that we all mentioned. You need to have, there's a lot of overheads involved. And with those facilities, you might score the ad that's paying you a lot of money and isn't really up your creative street, the independent Irish feature, and also maybe some short films and the pilot that's going off to Annecy or to other markets to bring work in. So that's why I think it's so important to kind of recognise the funding ecology and how it all can work together. So the next thing we were asked to talk about, which is quite an interesting one, and in the previous presentation they talked about Wild Mountain Time. I was asked to say, is there an Irish voice in music? And I was thinking about it. A lot of so what music does, and as a music supervisor, what music's doing in a film is generally informing the audience in a subconscious way. It's kind of saying what the emotional is, but it's also often saying where geographically it's located or what the kind of cultural background of the characters are. So Wild Irish Time would be a good example where quite an Irish sounding score was used. So I presume it was one of you three who's going to
Nope.
No, so it was the UK actual
Yes.
composer, and similarly with The Quiet Man and previously. So is there an Irish voice, and are we the only people who can do it? I think the answer obviously there is no. Or what does that mean, or what would it mean to you as composers to?
We'll rush at the same time.
Such a loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying that, look, I've benefited from me being employed to do non-Irish films, and I think, you know, you're getting into the area of cultural appropriation, which you can also use on your own culture. Yeah. I don't think I've any more right to. I mean, I would say that I possibly have more knowledge of stuff. I don't think it's about rights, and I kind of think, you know, I think we have grown into. We like to think we're a modern European nation now. We certainly have a lot of the dressings of that. And I think the idea of going back into kind of, I mean, surely an Irish voice is, for me, is about being modern and international. And it's a really tricky one. Again, I think it does go back to what knowledge you have and what expertise you have, rather than it being about rights and stuff. And you know, well done to that person who got to do that score. I could only watch 10 minutes of the film, so I didn't really get to hear the score. But it's still, no, really well done. They're, you know, there's somebody who's writing music, and again, it's a production with lots of people involved, and there's lots of people who paid their household bills for the year or whatever. And you know, but I'm really wary about the idea of an Irish voice. I think we got to be really careful with those notions. I think what we're trying to put ourselves forward as being, you're able to do anything based from Ireland now, and that means we have to have the kind of, because otherwise you end up kind of saying, well, if you want to do something that's an Irish thing, come to Ireland. But outside of that, we don't really know what we're talking about. I think that's not true, and it works the other way, you know.
And I was going to bring Natasha in because obviously you're Irish based. You're one of our Irish, and we're always very careful to say Irish based and talk about Irish based because obviously we're welcoming in members, and we recently welcomed in a Ukrainian members. We're welcoming in members who are living here, and primarily our interest is how much they are putting into the Irish industry. So your ethnic background is kind of Australian, kind of Eastern European, but you scored The Famine, which is such a hugely important Irish story, The Hunger, about the famine, and used the orchestra in it. So were you conscious doing that? You know, do I have to have an uilleann pipe in, or do I?
Yeah, and I've worked on two other very important Irish documentaries. It was definitely, as a non-Irish, I mean, I've been here a long time, but still, you know, I'm kind of half Irish, I always say, but I still got an Australian and Eastern European background. I think, I was really conscious, you know, what is an Irish, how much, and you know, it's interesting, in LA, we worked on a film there, which used Irish tunes as well. So it's interesting to see how do I use it here, but not be on the nose, because I found in LA it was just a lot more bolder, very Irish.
It's kind of over him.
Yeah, very,
like
very
Irish.
on the nose. And so with how I kind of hear the Irish sound, well, for me very much was bringing in Irish musicians. Definitely what I wanted for The Hunger, and getting them to interpret the music how they wanted themselves. But I think exactly what Stephen was saying, I think the Irish sound, if there's one, it's like what everything's going forward, the European sound. For me, I find it's modern. I mean, I would be more contemporary, classical writer. It's intimate. It's an intimate sound. It's nuanced.
Right.
That's what I would say is that I can hear.
Not Hans Zimmer.
No, we're not kind of. Whereas LA, I mean, great big scores, but I think there's also budgets involved with that. We have smaller budgets. The films, the way they're filmed, are more intimate as well. Where I think that translates to the music.
I think it comes back to what a composer does as well creatively, which is essentially respond to an artistic direction. So really, you know, and I get producers who are ringing saying, do you have somebody who can do quite a specific thing? I'm going, well, actually, probably all of our members could do that if you were to ask them, you know, or could do some variation of it. And speaking of that, Brian, you were previously with LX1, obviously, and you also continue to do performance as well. Is it a kind of career ambition as a composer for people to watch an art film or a series and go, oh, that's Brian Crosby scoring that? Does that come into play for a composer for screen?
I don't think you can. I don't know if I'd like it. I don't think you can pinpoint. I mean, there are a few like Thomas Newman and people like that where it's so distinctively him that you can immediately. But for me, I don't know. I'd always like people to say, okay, it was a nice, you know, it was a textural, tasteful piece of work, or whatever it is. And I would associate those kind of comments with. You know, sort of
even sometimes people say, well, actually, the best score is one that the audience aren't really consciously listening to, more so than they're
to a point. I mean, there's a sweet spot on that. I mean, you know, not so far as to say that it's something vanilla that, you know, just kind of passes by. And certainly, I think for anybody in the game, I think we'll always be listening to the score and judge it in some way, whether it's intentional or not. But yeah, I think there's a sweet spot with it does a job. Obviously, it should never take over. It should never overstay its mark. I mean, that's the basic rule of thumb.
I think you were the last closing piece in Oncology. You're probably responsible for quite a lot of that crying that went. If you could get paid in tears.
But interestingly, on that, in a way, when the budget is very small, when the production is very small, is the time you might actually get the chance to have more of a characteristic sounding score. Because I think of the stuff that I did over the years that was low budget. So Adam and Paul has a weird kind of Eastern European klezmer music feel to it.
Yeah.
Go back to that notion of what music it was. And Lenny and I were really, really careful to do that. Lenny's background is Rathfarnham Jewish. I'm Temple Oak Prod. Either way, we were outsiders to what the cultural thing was at the time. And so that was all about doing this, because they're kind of like Adam and Paul are like two guys schlepping across, looking on this odyssey. And so that was Irish music then. That was an Irish voice about a Dublin setting, but it's a universal story.
Yeah.
But there was no budget for that. There was no music budget for that. And Garage and various other ones where I'm using very, very limited palette, whatever, of instruments, which is also true of Colin Kuhn, is when there's no budget. So having an orchestral thing is completely out of the question.
Yeah.
And actually sometimes what happens when there's a big budget, there's orchestral music all over it, and it becomes actually kind of almost anonymous to some extent. So I think it's on the smaller ones where you have more autonomy as the composer to some extent. And it's not that the directors get what they're given because you're not paying any money. It isn't that. But there's an element of not being able to kind of order people around.
Right. Yeah, and I heard David Holmes talk about this as well in working on Killing Eve. And was it Killing Eve? Yeah, I mean, I think he put it down to Phoebe Waller-Bridge's amazing star power that she was able to hold back the producers, who are often the ones who are coming in with multiple notes, saying, I think it should have more oboes, or I don't know what the notes would say, but you can imagine sometimes there's...
Well, just on that, sorry, I'm just going to say, so what happens there is somewhere remote, so on Conversations with Friends and Normal People, there was a Hulu were involved who I'd never heard of prior to doing that. But there would be notes kind of filtered back, and basically there's probably 10 people sitting around a board table or sit on Zoom or whatever, who were getting paid a lot of money because they got hired into Hulu because they were somehow associated with a really successful thing before. This is their first thing, and they have to justify themselves. So even if they love the music, they'll go, well, I have to say something, I have to give a note. So they kind of go, well, maybe this and maybe that. And I mean, another example, and this is giving away a little secret, but on The Little Stranger, Lenny got a note on The Little Stranger because they felt kind of at the end, some American producers felt it wasn't working at the end, that perhaps the main guy who was played by Don Gleeson at the end, there could actually be a portrait of him in the attic of the place. And you just go, oh my, they don't even know what they're involved in, but they're actually involved in people who are trying to make stuff. So the executive thing, often those notes come through, and the problem is, as composers, we sometimes have to do we have to do up a piece to show that what we were doing was the right thing in the first place, which takes time and energy. And you're kind of going, I know this is being done just to prove them wrong. And in that case, what you want is a director or an Irish producer to protect you, to kind of go, you don't have to do that. I'll deal with that,
So it's kind of like
trust
the composer. And I just want to move on because I want to get this in quickly at the end as well. So trust is a big element, I think, of what a composer is selling. Essentially, you will come in towards the end of the film. Sometimes you are the person who has to fix the film because of various other things that are now too late to go back on. And so I would see, and I imagine, you develop very good working relationships, but you also you're reliant on kind of credits to particularly, looking at inward production, say to Ireland, if it was something that's coming to post here, how would they look at the Irish composers that we have in our directory and trust? Well, I could give Natasha this, 100 100 grand music budget and know that you'll deliver something that's, what do they call it, high quality
First
or
class.
first class. So because there's some, like there'd be a panel about gender and diversity, and like the figures for gender in screen composition are pretty horrific, both here and internationally. I think internationally they had something like the top 250 grossing films, had of them 5 were scored by female composers. That's not 5%, that's 5 out of 250. And we are in the process of doing an audit, which is similarly kind of tricky because of what we talked about in the previous panel, and the delay in productions getting made and brought to market and finding out composer information. But just to give you some information from Screen Ireland, funded 12 feature films were funded in the time period we looked at. 50% had an Irish-based composer on board, of which 0 were female. In TV drama series, of the series that we looked at, 40% had an Irish-based composer on board, of which none were female. So there was one non-Irish based female who was one of the non-Irish based, and similarly with the feature. In animation, 9 animation projects, 22% Irish based, and this is also influenced obviously a lot by co-production and having to spend in different countries. But 22 just were Irish based, of which 0 were female. Creative co-production, 4 projects, 1 Irish-based composer who was not female. Documentary, 10. 1 had no composer, 3 had Irish-based composers, and 2 of which were female. So, and if you were to look at those figures as well and look across the budget categories, and similarly with the Section 481 as well, like the highest budget productions do not have Irish-based composers on board. And looking at the ones that do, we had 6 Irish-based female composers out of 172 Section 481 funded productions that had engaged a composer. So 55 were Irish-based, and like I say, 6 were Irish-based female composers on their own, and 3 were an Irish composer working as a team with a male composer, Irish-based. So the figures are pretty stark. Now, in our membership, we have 20% are female members. In our associate membership, we have 50% are female members. So I don't want to put this all on you, Natasha, as the you know, but like what's the story? I mean, what I suppose the way I like to put it is, what do you think the Irish creative screen industry is losing by being this undiverse, by having such a low representation of both gender, which isn't really a diversity because we're talking 50-50 of the population, but also then, you know, there'd be very little.
Gosh, it's a big question, and I have put a lot of thought into it too. It's like, why is it the way it is? And I think, well, first of all, I mean, I'll just, from my point of view, like I came from concert music and then into film, and I did notice that at least in concert music there were more females and more bigger, you know, scores and whatever pieces being done by females. But the film industry in particular really has very few female composers. Like I think it's like, I know one time in LA they were saying it's like 2% of, you know, of composers were female, were working female composers, 2%. But definitely it's the budget thing. I've noticed it too. Definitely there's more females are coming in, and it's really interesting actually through, because I'm in education as well. I do guest lectures and I'm on panels to look at submissions for film scoring schools for students. So there's lots of women coming in. Actually, this was last year was the first time there was more females than males applying to do film composing, which was amazing. So they are coming in, but there's like a bottleneck. Lots of women, and then the budgets get higher and higher, and the women just kind of drop off, and it becomes more male. So I don't know. Going forward, I think just to encourage producers, directors, just to even consider a female, because it's going to, any diversity is going to bring something different in the music, a different perspective, you know. And I mean all diversity, you know, whatever, bring someone not from Dublin. I mean, that's the other, you know, thing that we, you know, if you're Dublin based, but if you're Galway based, or Donegal composer, that's harder as well. So just kind of think outside the box and just get these people to the table to pitch for films and consider what they might bring. So it's just kind of trying to change perspective. And I think it's just exposure. Women, I mean, I think growing up, I never knew of a female composer. I never studied a female composer. So I think that's going to change its exposure, seeing that it can be a female career as well.
And we should actually talk about an Irish female success story in LA that I don't think anyone talks about, which is Amy Doherty, who just was the first woman composer to score a feature DreamWorks animation, which is Spirited or Unspirited, or the second followed to Spirited. Is there something that the industry could do? I mean, even for me, looking at the figures, it's relatively low. It's 30% are Irish based anyway. So what would, Stephen or Brian, what could the Irish screen industry do to maybe, is there a point even investing? Maybe we should just let composers from LA do all the big jobs.
I was talking to Stephen about this. Like, I think to look at the issue, I think we need to zoom out a little bit, because, I mean, there are certainly issues within the industry, down to commissioning and maybe the lack of role models that young women entrants can look up to. Well, I think it's more of a societal issue, actually, and I think, especially as composers, both men and women, commence and start going on their career, and then family happen, and their overheads become bigger, and everything changes. And I don't think Ireland are very good at transitioning there, or having some kind of social support system to allow, for example, a parent go back to work after a kid. I mean, just to give a brief comparison, when I was living in Berlin, we had means-tested childcare, and that had a very direct consequence of allowing, especially women, because if I can make a generalization, it's usually women who, on balance, take more childcare. But it was constructed in a way to allow women get back to work. And parallel to that, I was able to take a 6-month, is it maternity or parental leave or whatever? Maternity leave paid by the state based on my income. And so then that allowed me to kind of, take more work at home, allowed my wife to get back to work. And so, I mean, they're two simple things, and it doesn't seem outrageous to me that they exist. It seems like it's a basic, standard right that we should all have. But that, I think, even looking at broader social structures would really help in what we're talking about. Because I think it addresses what you're saying as well, as lots of women entering, and then at some point there's a crunch, and that's got to be related to family as well as other commissioning practices.
Yeah, and I think. I was going to say, I totally agree, because I was thinking about that too, and the composer life, like what's sometimes demanded of us.
That's a good point.
In
It
general,
takes so much work. It's 6 days a week,
Oh.
till midnight every day on a project, and that's not something you can juggle with family.
Yeah, getting advice from people. And but though, I mean, you guys have families, so you do, but there's a lot of support. There's many years of investment in a career. I think as well, Stephen. Now, obviously, you came from being a director. You were very involved in the craft of filmmaking, anyway. Like, how do composers?
Craft, arsing round, mate.
But I mean, what would you say to a producer who's like going? Because I've also had producers ring, and on some of the projects that I've seen, ring saying we'd like to engage a female composer, and I'm just getting the nod here. So, if there's any questions, put hands up. Oh. Sorry, yeah.
So just a brief one, not to detain this. Great discussion, by the way. I'm John. I live kind of on the crossover between business and art, but I'm here as a fan. 2 quick questions. One to illuminate me. My understanding is that in the games console end of art making, if it's art, Xbox, PlayStation, etc., that Irish composers dominate the music scoring sector in that industry globally now. I may be wrong. And the second one is on the money piece. You've touched on the gender piece, which we talked about after lunch, but I mean, there are large companies now, and a large company in EU terms is 250 plus, and there's lots of large companies. They are now, by the end of this year, going to have to report under their ESG agenda exactly how they're treating everything from the environment to their board governance and to the SPC, SG. The social piece includes what the EU calls modern slavery. we're kind of talking about modern slavery here as we talk about it. And the serious bit is that there will be a transparency forced on all people in all industries. And it's not just the firm, it might be a big production company, it's who they buy from and procure services from and issue contracts to. So there's an opportunity to kind of turn that to the advantage of composers and other contractors who the Netflixes are pushing away, and have it much more transparent and say, if you're Netflix, you have to comply with other people's agendas as well as just your own.
Absolutely, and thank you. And in support of that, the Copyright Directive was, which was a European legislation, was brought into Irish law last November, very quietly, and nothing really has been done with it. But that is going to make it a right to expect fair and proportional remunerations for all creators going in. So, and I have personally, I come from a marketing background. I have no doubt that Netflix and any of the big streamers can rapidly change their business models to suit requirements and legislation. We need, and creators need, the backing of legislators to bring in those laws, to not be afraid of the impact on inward production, and to support the composers taking the rights, because I know they can change their business models. And it's interesting what you're saying about modern slavery. As to, I wouldn't have thought that Irish composers were leading the way now in terms of video games. No, there are some. I mean, Emer Noon is one of the most known who would have worked a lot in that area, and she is now, which again shows to the right side. She is spending a lot of time traveling the world with orchestras, conducting large orchestras who are performing the works of composers who wrote for video games. In lots of cases, those composers may not be returning any revenue from that if they have not held on to some part of the intellectual property. And we are seeing that more and more. Someone was talking about the back end associated with, I know about this with young kids in my house, with YouTubers who play games on YouTube. Now that YouTube is coming under, the having to pay rights holders, there is a back end associated with that, where traditionally the video games industry were kind of, I suppose, forcing composers to give up all their rights. Now composers are going, hang on a second. And that's where I feel like business models are very aware of the value of rights. And it's so important that, that our legislators bring that some of that income back to the economy. Anyone else got a quick? Yes, hi, Sue.
Two quick things. First of all, great points about the parenting, particularly as it impacts on women. And just to say, Raising Films Ireland is now relatively recently launched and is sort of presenting all of these issues, and will be lobbying and looking into all of that. So I think great points. The other thing, Sarah, I was just wondering, I mean, shocking to hear the statistics, but looking at directors in the past, looking at cinematographers currently, and so on, we know that is not outrageously unique. But I'm just wondering, to be fair, Screen Ireland and BAI have done a certain amount for directors and writers. Are you working with them? Are they aware of these dreadful percentages?
Well, this is why we're building this kind of investment case, because unfortunately composers have been left out of the gathered data to date, and nobody has gathered. And that isn't a kind of conspiracy or intentional. I think often it's because the composer comes on at the end of the production, where maybe the funder has, lost kind of some level of contact. Similarly with the skills requirement for Section 481, it's very unusual that goes into a music department because of when the composer is maybe brought on board. So yeah, absolutely, we're bringing this as an investment case. I think we are saying composers need quite a tailored investment, and we would love, like they've set up the talent academies, skills academies. Unfortunately, composers haven't had a place in those yet. So we would love something that would do that, and maybe going to them, we can say, well, what was the experience of directors? What was the experience of female DOPs? Is there something that can change there? Because maybe supporting them with lower budget funds isn't how they get through that bottleneck. But absolutely.
Thanks, Sue.
Thanks. Hi.
I suppose just on the more creative side, in terms of working with, say, sound design or post-sound teams, what would your process be in that? Would you have a sort of collaborative process with them, or do you like working with sound design when you're writing, or is that kind of come afterwards, I suppose?
Oh.
I mean, to
It
do
just-
it quite quickly.
It just it varies from production to production. I mean, generally, I would be kind of aware that it's going on, but I wouldn't be tapping into it all the time. Sometimes it depends on what it is. It just depends on the project, what the genre is, and all that stuff. You know, a lot of sound designers, there's a kind of common area now in a way. If it's the score is orchestral or whatever, there probably isn't a common area. But if it's much more electronic or abstract or whatever, then there probably is. But it would vary from production to production. I just want to say, sorry, very briefly, the idea that there isn't a cost. So if composers were to be paid by the hour, it would be a phenomenally huge budget. But it does mean that what often happens is people get a really good quality score, and they think in terms of financial terms it's 30 grand, whatever. But the cost is often to the composer in terms of their mental health, the amount of hours they give up or whatever, because it's what they do, it's how they have to. So they're kind of forced to do it. And if you think about the music as being one of the elements that you see when you go to the cinema, you think about what the production costs to get all those actors, pay the actors, be away for 3 months, whatever, you're talking millions and millions. Then you're talking about the post-production apart from that. Again, it's probably a few million. And then it comes to the music, it's 100 grand. And you kind of go, but hang on, but all the people that Natasha was talking about, how do they get paid? Well, they don't. They do a deal. They take it on the chin, because if you don't do that, somebody will do it. Or they'll get somebody who's, you know, for your background, you can either get a child to paint the scenery, or you can get somebody who's really, really good at it. And it's not always true that you get what you pay for. I think people have been getting much more than they pay for when it comes to this. And there is a cost to that, you know. So
I think, are we done, Simi?
I think so. Yeah, I think our next
Thank you.
hour.
I'm not. I want to keep going.
Thank you so much for listening to
Thanks,
us.
everybody.
And thank you so much to the panel, Brian Crosby, Natasha Goldberg, Stephen Renix. Go to Screen Composers Guild Ireland and look at the directory and filmmakers. Talk to composers. Working as a music supervisor, always encourage filmmakers to reach out and talk to different composers, listen to music, that, you know, a conversation isn't a contract in blood, and treat creators fairly.
Thank you so much.